Welcome to the Gruyter Conversations. My name is Alexandra Koronka-Ikish. I'm the editorial communications manager at the publishing house and host of today's conversation. So the world around us is changing with incredible velocity, and with it changes the scholarship that is, in essence, attempting to find answers to some fundamental questions that surround us today. I'm thinking questions such as, how do we produce knowledge? How do we present it? How can we better understand our societies, past and present? And ultimately, what it is that makes us human. And so we find ourselves in the midst of remapping a shifting landscape, which was, in fact, the title of a conference panel this spring, chaired by today's guests, Andy Byford and Claudia Nitschke, professors at Durham University School of Modern Languages and Cultures, as well as active contributors to discussions about modern languages and its identity, which in turn have a lot to do with the questions that I raised earlier and that will constitute the topics of today's conversation. Welcome, Claudia and Andy, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So modern languages as a discipline has arguably always had a lot to say about human existence. Language, as it were, is sort of traditionally associated with being a human being. It is also by many understood to construct the very basis of civilization itself. Having said that, modern languages is by no means just about language or learning languages even. It's also very much about understanding human society, culture, etc. In a way, I'm thinking modern languages is the study of humanity through various different viewpoints. And so I wonder if the two of you could provide some key findings in the field of modern languages that you'd say help us to understand what it means to be human, no less, or what it is like to live in human society.
The academic field that we call modern languages is indeed one that is in the most fundamental way concerned with this question of what it means to be human. One philosophical text that I personally see as seminal in the history of this discipline is actually the treatise on the origin of language by the German Enlightenment philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder, which was published in the late 18th century. And in this treatise, Herder actually starts off by this axiom that the human being is the creature of language. But the question, of course, is what does that actually mean? Modern languages, of course, study humanity, but they don't necessarily study empirical humans as much as what makes humans human. And that is, I think, what Herder had in mind when he spoke of the human being. So what is it that makes humans human? And one of the things that does make humans human is, I would say, a meaning. So the capacity to both create meaning, encode meaning, decode meaning, live in a meaningful way, project meanings on things, derive meanings from something else. And I think I would say that if one had to look at the sort of the essence of what our field is concerned with, that would be it. And I think that is where this idea of language actually comes from. I think when Herder says that the human being is the creature of language, he doesn't necessarily have in mind either concrete languages that we sort of take for granted these days, or indeed some kind of abstract capacity for language. Rather, I think he uses it in a much broader, almost like a metaphorical sense, to refer to an entire bundle of codes, encodings, and meanings themselves that are inevitably encoded, as well as entire sort of processes of encoding and decoding meaning. And that is, I think, very much what we study.
Well, I think just two more comments. I think modern languages have become more critical of this notion of human exceptionalism, so what makes humans in a sense, and more aware of the interconnectedness of all life on the planet, especially in the wake of climate change and other crises. We've begun to see ourselves more consistently as part of larger global and planetary contexts, and also as part of ecosystems that are beyond individual or national control. So life in the Anthropocene, which is the epoch in which human activity has become the most dominant influence on climate and the environment, is proving quite challenging for human beings. And we have to find out more about the place for humans in these increasingly complex and meshed networks. And the second comment is on language, because Andy referred to Herder and the origin of language. Language as the unique human feature has also become more controversial in this sense. So especially in the digital and environmental humanities, one encounters transhuman or even post-human forms of language. If you think of language produced by artificial intelligence, or Eduardo Cohn's notion of a sylvan language, a language shared by trees. So I think there is a conspicuous shift from the focus on human difference, which is obviously still methodologically relevant, toward a notion of commonality, similarity, and interconnections. And these interconnections tie human beings to social and cultural environments, but also to non-human nature and even things. If you think of Bruno Latour, who argues in the context of his famous network theory that everything in the social and natural world, also objects, exists in constantly shifting networks of relationships. And these dynamic ecologies have come to the fore in the past decades as a major concern and topic in modern languages.
Thank you. I'm also delighted to that you have given me such an elegant way to proceed to the next question that I wanted to ask the both of you, which very much has to do with what you've just addressed. Because in fact, one trend that we can observe in scholarship, but also more generally in today's world, as it were, is globalization and a sort of increasing interconnectivity. So we now live in this global society that's interwoven by all sorts of connections in intricate ways. And it's really interesting because modern languages as a field was sort of born in a very different context, in the context of nations being born, nation building, thinking a lot of the time in confines such as language or country or a region, but it's now moving above and beyond, so to speak, and it's exploring the world through very different lenses, such as you've also mentioned the planetary or the global or the cosmopolitan. So my question to you is, what do you think we can learn from these new perspectives that we couldn't earlier? In other words, what does the sort of transnational or global give us that we didn't have before?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. And there are certainly two sides to this medal, because as you pointed out, nationalism was a prominent driving force in the 18th and 19th centuries when scholarly disciplines, as we know them today, started emerging more and more distinctively. This went hand in hand with the ongoing systematic exploration and indeed colonization of the world, which was measured and categorized. You might know Daniel Kehlmann's novel Measuring the World about Humboldt and Gauss, so that fits into that period. And modern languages and cultures are an interesting case here, as they are closely associated with the traditional field of philology. And in this sense, they also inherited a complicated colonial legacy, as Siraj Ahmed argues in his book, Archaeology of Babel, the colonial foundation of the humanities. And he shows how different cultural traditions suddenly became very selectively text-based and standardized, and how other oral and performative aspects of certain cultures were obliterated. And Ahmed suggests that philology, in fact, reinforced colonial hierarchies, and he would go as far as was claiming that it still does that. So the conceptualization of different national philologies was based on a selective understanding of traditions and materials seen as worthwhile from a distinctly European angle. But at the same time, the world proved intrinsically connected even then. So not even then, but then as well. So if you analyze German language literature in the 18th century, you always look at complex intertextual networks, which were in many ways global, as they also incorporated non-Western traditions. Goethe first used this concept of world literature at the beginning of the 19th century, a seminal and certainly hotly debated concept, to describe the international circulation and reception of literary works in Europe, again, also including non-Western text. And we are becoming more and more aware of this connectivity, as you said, but also more mindful of the exclusivity of certain traditions. And that's one of the reasons why current research very carefully evaluates and includes available texts as artifacts, which weren't part of the canon, but were marginalized and forgotten. At any rate, the concept of transnational modern languages stands for such an awareness and a nuanced transnational approach to these questions, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yes, I mean, I think to add to this, I would say that it is certainly, as Claudia has sort of already elaborated, the case that modern languages as a discipline have sort of were historically kind of beholden to particular very contingent patterns of humanity's kind of division and inequality, and they have, you know, historically been prone to sort of follow these patterns of humanity's division into, say, nations or empires in a way that might not have always been as self-reflective. And so one of the tasks that we're facing today is actually to try and rethink a bit more what it means to actually be dependent on these historically contingent ways of structuring the world and humanity, or rather the humanity into. And one of the reasons for this is that language, apart from connecting us, is also in many ways a divider of humanity. But there is this obviously a case to argue in what way humanity is actually part of a sort of a whole. And one of the problems that modern languages have from a methodological point of view is to sort of try and reconcile the study both of cultural and linguistic specificity, but also to place that specificity in this global world. And that is, I think, not an easy thing to do at all, because you want to sort of give everything to provide a kind of deep knowledge of the specific, but at the same time, you don't want for it to exclude the bigger picture. One of the solutions that we're sort of working through as a discipline today is to sort of try and think beyond the binary of the specific and the general, and to transform that precisely through a model of multiplicity and interconnectedness.
Yes, but also talking about divisions, there's another kind of division, I suppose, that is now sort of being surpassed, if you will, increasingly. And what I'm talking about is another trend that is coming to the fore in academia, if you will, and also in modern languages, to my understanding, and that is interdisciplinarity, or the increasing interdisciplinarity, rather. So bringing together various academic fields under one common research roof, if you will. And modern languages itself is spanning a multitude of academic boundaries. And what was really interesting to me is that this is by no means just in the humanities or the social sciences even, but also the natural sciences. Indeed, both of your research interests encompass crossovers to vastly different fields, be that medicine or law or environmental studies, psychology, cognitive sciences, etc. So my question to you is, how do you think bringing together these different fields help us in our pursuit to understand the world around us better?
I think that there is something to be said about modern languages as such, as a particular kind of disciplinary cluster that is different in many ways to some other prominent disciplines, let's say history or anthropology, where there's a sort of a perhaps a clearer disciplinary sense. And many people have sort of worried that modern languages lack a disciplinary specificity, that creates a weakness, that is not patrolling its disciplinary boundaries enough. My own view is that on the contrary, this sort of relatively lax attitude towards patrolling boundaries is precisely what then enables people in modern languages to sort of assemble as a group that is actually very diverse, and that can work with several different overlapping disciplinary identifications, whether it's specializing in a particular language, culture, part of the world, or in a particular kind of object of study. And I think that the way in which we kind of think of disciplines as not just sort of separated territories, but almost like embedded affiliations and embedded frameworks which kind of can work with each other and sort of suddenly create something new because they're brought together. I think modern languages lend themselves really well to that model, and I think that's something that we need to sort of almost like champion and cherish rather than be embarrassed about.
But it's also really interesting that you say, which is something that I, for instance, haven't really thought about, how there's a mutual impact, so to speak. So it's not just to say, modern languages is influenced by its collaboration or the research work, the common research work with whatever other field, but the other way around. Claudia, is there any sort of particular research area or project that you can think of in that context?
Yes, certainly. I think sort of, as you pointed out, I work on legal phenomena as portrayed in literary texts. And you can definitely find a greater flexibility and openness in the literary documents than you might find in historical kind of documentations about the same time, as, literary texts also explore the paradoxes, the unchosen roads, if you like, of history in many ways. But there is something else I would like to add to Andy's point. Obviously, I think that the openness and compatibility with other subject areas are a distinct advantage of modern languages, as Andy has already highlighted, as they can serve as a hub, that connects different scholarly and scientific fields, but also different cultural perspectives channeled and cultivated through different languages is also a point Andy made. But what I would like to add is that the artifacts, sources, and objects with which modern languages engage do reflect the world and its complexity. And it's therefore not surprising that diverse approaches and methodologies unlock different aspects of the materials we work with, And maybe as a further related question, how can we employ a comparative perspective on different world traditions in an attempt to overcome Eurocentrism? And modern languages and cultures have been working on these questions for a long time, and they can help formulate a collective response to the challenges of the 21st century, even when they are not concerned with contemporary materials at all. And I think that's an important point as well. As you know, modern languages also include medieval and early modern studies, and my own research is focused on 18th and 19th century literature. And currently, I already referred to that, I'm working on the correlation of property and nature in the 18th century in literature. And one can clearly show that there is no intuitive, natural, universal understanding or givenness of social core concepts such as property. And this specific openness is instructive and provides a platform from which we can envision different switch points in the past, as I just mentioned. And I think the important point here is that through that, we can also envision different futures, which again helps us to challenge and rethink the seemingly natural hierarchies and power structures in place. So it's an important tool in many ways.
Speaking of the future, which is where we're sort of directing our attention with this last question that I would like to phrase here, because one thing that undoubtedly shapes the way we live today and we will live in the foreseeable future is, amongst other things, technology. So there's rapid technological advancement all around us, especially, in recent years. We've seen the rise of generative AI. Now we've got artificial intelligence that's capable of producing all sorts of things, all sorts of content, from text to image and video. And that is raising all kinds of questions also around the formation and consumption of knowledge and culture, which in turn have a lot to do with modern languages. So my question is, how does modern languages, which you've also addressed this in the course of our conversation today, is in many ways rooted in philology, the study of texts and books, sort of help us to make sense of this new, very different world and the enormous change that we're experiencing today? If you'd like to take the ball further, Claudia.
Yeah,
because I think that's where we left off with the previous.
Absolutely.
question.
I mean, many of these technological innovations concern the very premise to basic forms of communication. For example, the way we read and make sense of information is affected by the internet, by how we take in information online. If you think of hypertext, as hypertext, that means online documents that include links to other documents. So hypertext require different reading patterns, as there is no linear way through the information, and the readers find their own path through the different interconnected documents. And as human brains are rewired by repeated tasks, online reading and hypertext reading have changed the way we read generally, and they often compromise our close reading skills as well. And as Catherine Hales, kind of expert in the field of the digital humanities, she has pointed out that we need to rethink reading completely and examine how it might work in a world that is increasingly intermedial, so in which words are combined with sounds, animations, films, graphics, and images. But she also suggests that literary studies can aim for a novel disciplinary coherence by teaching different forms of literacy. That means not only book reading, but also online reading across a diverse range of media. And she suggests that people need to be encouraged to maintain close and hyper reading practices side by side, and must learn or relearn to focus on the interpretation of meaning and context through the analysis of different patterns that can be recognized in the text or hypertext or intermediate documents at hand. I think being able to read and think through information consistently and critically is obviously an important skill for citizens and democracies. So a meta-reflection on how we read and comprehend complex information in the digital age, as provided by Hales, can raise awareness and help identify deficits that need to be addressed, and reckoned with as well.
In some ways, the transformations in technology that you've mentioned they can be interpreted in different ways. On the one hand, it is sort of creating a new form, space, medium of meaning creation and sort of social interaction, cultural creation. So it's definitely a new phenomenon, but that simply needs to be addressed by scholars in the field who need to sort of essentially apply the pre-existing methodologies and develop new ones in order to cope with differences of medium, and obviously of differences in the kind of culture that is generated. We've got colleagues who are very interested in that and who are now specializing in not in sort of literary text, but in I don't know, social media interactions, but employing not dissimilar sort of principles, even if methodologies are now very different and rooted in the technology itself. So there's definitely methodological innovation going on within the discipline in order to basically tackle this sort of now, increasingly dominant cultural form. But I had an impression that your question at the beginning also sought to address the question that you started off with, namely, in what way this technology might be transforming what it means to be human, and does it. And we've definitely, again, got colleagues who are very sort of interested in this from a sort of philosophical point of view, and who might actually argue that again, it's not necessarily that you know, that the principles are radically changing. It's just that the technology is changing, and that, you know, human beings have been made by technologies from the word go. It's just that the tools were different, and now these new tools will obviously transform what it means to be a human being yet again in new ways. And the only thing that it seems to me is that you know, it's at the moment, it's still early days to say what will happen. The technologies are moving very rapidly, but in often sort of slightly unpredictable ways.
Absolutely.
And I slightly hesitate to predict the future at this point.
I just wanted to add that indeed this notion of, you know, you may know the term cyborg, and this notion of transhumanism is indeed one of the budding areas in modern languages as well. Even though, you know, we have encountered different media revolutions in the past, you know, the question is really, is this one different? You know, is the plasticity of the brain that we are aware of differently affected by this, by the new technologies? And as Andy said, it's very hard to say at this point, you know, what it will mean for us as human beings.
It was worth a shot to ask it, but I'm certainly very excited to see where this journey takes us. Well, I'm sure there would be many other equally exciting topics to discuss here, but for now, I thank you very much for this insightful and very stimulating conversation, and I wish you all the success and fun with your ongoing research projects, one of which I might add at this point is a handbook on modern languages, which will in fact discuss many of the topics that we raised today in much more detail, and that will be published by De Gruyter, a very ambitious and topical project that we're all really excited about. So I thank you also, dear listener, for tuning in today. Please make sure to subscribe to our channel and join us again next time. Thank you and goodbye.